our second week of Philippians. Last week in Philippians chapter 1, we kind of started several things that are going to be themes all the way through the book about how there's joy to be found even when life is hard, about how God is going to carry us through to completion, and God is going to take us someplace, sometimes even we don't see it, and how one day we're going to be with Christ. That this life that we have to live is Christ, but to die one day will be gain. And all those themes came up last week, and you're going to see some of those themes repeat tonight, and then every night of this series as we go through Philippians. Philippians, again, just to recall, is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the Philippian church, or the church at Philippi. It seems like they're one of his favorite churches. He's very complimentary to them all the way through. It seems like they were a church that he really cared about. We think it was written almost the very end of Paul's life, and so a lot of his thinking and theology, he had, was repeating some stuff he had been teaching all his life, and you get to read this interaction that he has. He's writing from prison. You get to read this interaction he has with the church, and we still can pick up a lot of wisdom about how to live our lives today. And even though we don't go through the same persecution that he did and that those Philippians did, we still can find a lot of things here that are going to apply to our life today. And this chapter tonight, chapter 2, is one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible, especially the first 15 verses or so. And so as we get into that thing, I hope I can convey it in a way to you that it means a lot to me, and I hope I can convey that to you. So here we go, chapter 2 of Philippians, very first thing, and we talk about this anytime you do a study with me at all. Whenever you see the word therefore pop up pretty early in your deal, you need to look at the verse or two before that to see what he's referring to. And here, when he says therefore, he's talking about how the Philippians were called to suffer. That's the last verse, chapter 1, verse 29. He says that you've been appointed to suffer for Christ, and you've been appointed to go through some hard times. I don't know why you're going through, but God must have a purpose for it, and now you're in the middle of it. Therefore, he says, right, because you're in the middle of hard time, getting a lot of pressure on you from outside, therefore, he says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness or compassion, he says, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, and being one in spirit and of one mind. So let's think about his flow of thought here. Because you're getting so much pressure from the outside, because you're suffering, therefore, it's time to really come together and be strong together as a church. Now, the American church certainly not going through the same kind of persecution that you saw in Philippi, but the church is always under pressure from the outside. There are always people and institutions and organizations that will take little shots at the church or take shots at traditional Bible teaching. That's not changed. That's always been true. And whenever the pressure is coming on from the outside, it becomes more important that on the inside, we come together. And that's what Paul's talking about when he uses phrases like-minded and the same love and one mind, one in the Spirit, all those ideas. I want you to come together. And he says, and he lists all these if, but you can look at this word if being more of a sense or because. The word if makes sense, but he's using it in the sense of like because you got all this encouragement from being with Christ, because you're comforted by his love, because you share in the Spirit, because he's been good to you at every turn. Paul says, then make my joy complete and take it to the next step. And the next step here is just to be one. There's a lot of work involved in that. It won't be easy. It's not a natural thing. The Philippian church apparently weren't totally being there. That's why Paul encourages them to do it. All this pressure come from the outside had kind of made them start to fight a little bit on the inside. And we've seen some of that even with the COVID stuff and the things over the last year or so. As all the pressure came on not just the church but on everybody, some of the relationships here have become a little more fractured. People are a little more stressed. People are a little less willing to commit and serve than they might have been some other time because there's all this stress. And Paul's saying, man, when all the stress is coming on, that's when you really have to make a decision to come together. And that's what he's kind of saying here. And then he tells you how to do it. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility value others above yourselves. And that whole idea here, he says, it's kind of the golden rule, but the golden rule lived out. He says, you don't look to your own interests, but each of you look to the interests of others. So don't do anything out of selfish ambition. Don't do anything out of vain conceit. Vain conceit and selfish ambition are those things that are going to promote you but not promote the group. They're going to take you way ahead, but they're going to leave other people behind. Paul here says do nothing out of those things. And I don't think it's wrong for you to work for a promotion or anything like that. I don't think that's exactly what he's hitting at here. I think he's talking more about in the context of the church, in the context of us coming together. Man, you want to think about the others first. However, this advice, this works in everything. I mean, if a married couple, husband and wife, both committed to live this is just verse 3 and 4 here. If a married couple committed, I'm going to put your interest before mine, and he said that to her, and she said that to him, and they lived that way, I mean, that couple's not going to have trouble. I mean, always the trouble that comes in marriage is when one person looks at the other and says, in some form or fashion, you're not serving me enough. After all I've done for you, you're not giving me enough. I mean, if a couple really made a decision to live this, and I'm not going to think about my own needs, I'm going to think about your needs first. I mean, if a parent and a child did this, you know, a parent and a teenager are fighting every week. If a parent and a teenager made a decision, this is where we're going to be. I'm not going to think of myself first. I'm going to try to think about what benefits you the most. And the parent does that for the teenager, and the teenager does that for the parent. This may be a dream world for some of you watching, but man, what an amazing thing that would be. And the same thing here in the church. I mean, if you make the decision that you're really going to try to put other people first, and genuine about it. I mean, not just put them first so that you look good, but that'd be that selfish ambition again, or that vain conceit. But you're going to put them first because what God wants, well, I mean, that's powerful. And it might be at just this point that you're reading this and think, well, who would do that? I mean, is there anybody really who would value other people above themselves and never look to their own interests and do nothing out of selfish ambition? Is there anybody really who would choose that kind of life? Well, there was one, Paul says. He says, in all your relationships and all your mind with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus. Jesus did that. Jesus could have certainly looked out for his own interests first, and he never does that. Jesus certainly could have looked out for his own agendas, but he never did that. And there were times to cave on that. There were times when the pressure of the crowd would have been easier for him to retreat. Would have been easier to get out of step with whatever God had in mind. It would have been easier to go a different direction. On the cross, they taunt him with that. You know, he saved other people, he can't save himself. Well, he couldn't save himself because he saved all the other people. And Paul says in your relationships with one another, you want to have that same mindset. I'm looking for your interest before I look for my own. And then he explains how Jesus did it. Now, there's some people who think these next 5 verses are poetic enough that they might have even been an early Christian hymn. Some of the poetry is lost in the translation from Greek to English. But he's talking, even in English, he's talking more of it's poetic. It's not metaphor, but he's trying to explain what kind of guy Jesus was. And here's how he says it. He says, being in the very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. This first line here at the top, being in the very nature God, can be taken 2 different ways, and both ways would normally work. One way is to say, kind of in spite of the fact that he was just like God, in spite of the fact that he was just like God, he made himself a servant. Right? In spite of the fact that he had all the power in the world, in spite of the fact that he could have done whatever he wanted, in spite of the fact that he deserves to be worshipped, in spite of the fact that in his heart of hearts he's really a king, he chose to become nothing, to maybe to teach us a lesson or to show us how it's to be done. And that's a fine way to take that as a translation. It's called a concessive idea, in spite of. Some people take it that way, and that might not be a bad way to take it, but I've never taken it that way, and I don't think it's normally the way that phrase is used. Normally that phrase is used as causation, because of, and that changes what it means. If it's causation, and that's normally how that's used, it's supposed to be saying, because he's like God. He didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped. But because he's like God, he served. Because he's like God, he took on the nature of a servant and made himself small. I think that's more likely what it means, and that actually does some little bit of teaching about heaven. Even in heaven, even when he has all the glory right at his fingertips, Luke says he will still dress himself to serve us. there's still some indication that even in heaven, he's going to be lifting us up. Even in heaven, God's not going to be thinking of his own interests first, but even there, God is love, and he's thinking of us first. And Jesus did that not in spite of the fact that he was God, but because he was God. I'm getting into the weeds. Let me move on. He says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And Paul's point here is he didn't have to die. Pilate tried to set him free. The priests would have set him free if he just admit that he was lying, and he never does. He never varies from what he said, and he stays true to it even though it costs him everything. Therefore, and again, that therefore is looking because of all the things that Jesus did, therefore God has exalted him to the highest place and gave him a name that's above every name, that the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Because he humbled himself and became so small, God gave him everything. Okay, well, what's the lesson for us? It seems to be, by implication, if you will trust God in this life and make yourself small to lift up the other people in your sphere of relationships, and in particular people in the church, but I think it could be any of your relationships, if you'll on purpose trust God enough to do that, he notices. And he's going to exalt the people who trust him in this thing. I think that's what it's saying. He exalted Jesus, and while every knee certainly won't bow to us, we're not giving quite as much as Jesus, so we won't get the ultimate reward either. We're going to be rewarded one day for the sacrifices we make in this area. It's really beautiful stuff, and it is poetic. He goes on. He says, therefore, my dear friends, as you've always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it's God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. This section here, the end part of verse 12 and the first part there of chapter verse 13, powerful stuff. It talks about two different parts that work together. You work out your salvation. You've got to do something. It's not enough for you just to say, I believe, and then hit the recliner the rest of your life. You've got to do something. You've got to take a step forward. You've got to agree to be part of this thing, knowing full well that God is working in you. And God is going to work through you. Earlier in chapter 1, verse 6, we learned that God is going to carry his work into completion. God's going to do his part. But here now in verse 12, we're told that we need to work out with God. Not so that we can be saved, not work out for your salvation, but to work out your salvation, to show it off, to let it shine. And again, in the context of this, how do you do that? Well, you serve. You learn to put your wants second. You learn to put what you want second, and you learn to lift other people up and what they want first. You do it in your church. You do it in your family. You do it in your marriage. You do it in all your important relationships, and you do it with God. You trust that God's going to carry it through, and you give God the glory to make that happen, and give God room to make that happen in your life. He says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. That I've joked about that before, but that verse right there, that verse 14, that could be a memory verse for a lot of people. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so you can become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Now, there's a couple things going on here that are cool. First of all, this not grumbling and not arguing, the words he uses there are words that are pretty rare in the Greek, and they're used in the Old Testament to talk about the Israelites when they came out of Egypt, that they were always grumbling and they were always arguing and they were always doubting in God. And Paul says, you don't want to be like that. So he's trying to, if you remember some of those old stories, he's trying to kind of put that memory in your head by the word choices that he makes. You know, they got in trouble over and over and over again because they just didn't trust God. Don't you be like that. That's part of what he's saying. But you don't have to have an Old Testament doctorate to understand the meaning of do everything without grumbling or arguing, right? You don't need to know what the Greek says to know that grumbling and arguing, Paul says, are bad. And it really is possible, I think, as a Christian to start trying to attack that, but it's hard. As Americans, most of us are great at grumbling. Most of us are great at arguing. You look at a long line at Walmart or a crowded highway, and you'll just see it over and over again. People are rolling their eyes, and they're slumped back, and they're so frustrated. We're quickly aggravated if anything slows us down or disrupts our agenda, even for a minute. We learn it when we're just in the crib to cry out for somebody to come and help us out. And for some people, they have learned that if they cry out and pout and grumble and argue the rest of their life, people do things for them. And some of the people watching this tonight are people like that, and sometimes I'm a person like that. And Paul says, this is not you anymore. We want to be like Christ. Christ constantly put others first. You need to do that too, and trust that God's going to make it right. And certainly you do that in the big things if your faith is really being tested, but you got to do it in the small things too. You know, as a Christian, I'm going to have an attitude of serving you and not expecting you to always be serving me. And I know most Christians think that they do that, but very few Christians do. Paul, then, the second thing, you'll see these quote marks here at the end, and here he's kind of indirectly quoting something out of Deuteronomy 32:5, but it's the opposite. In Deuteronomy 32:5, he's talking again about the children of Israel. He's talking about how they came out and they always were complaining and they always were arguing. And Deuteronomy 32:5 says they were not his children. They were at fault, and they were warped and they were crooked. And Paul takes that accusation lobbed at Israel in Deuteronomy, and he says, but we're not to be like that. And if we'll let God really do his work in us, we'll be just the opposite. We will be his children. And we won't have any accusation lobbed against us, even though the rest of the world seems to be going the other direction. And it's cool stuff. And then he says, you'll shine like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then he says, I'll be able to boast on Judgment Day, the day of Christ, that I didn't run or labor in vain. If I see you doing that, Paul says, then I know you're really a mature Christian. And that's still true. When I see somebody who has committed to serve, both in church and in their family and in their house, and not serve in this martyr way, you know, making sure everybody knows how much of a servant you are, whining to your kids or whining to the people. Can't you see how hard I'm working? But when it really comes from a joyful heart, I mean, when a person has really learned to put their own ego kind of on the back seat and to lift other people up, that's when I know they're getting it. I mean, that's the last step. And what Paul says here, then I can boast about you. Man, me too. That's when I'm going to know that people really are getting it. And honestly, in my own life, that's the biggest barometer that I've got it. And this picture here about shining like stars in the sky, it's like God looks down at this dark world, and it's all warped and crooked, right? But he sees little bits of light shining. And it's the Christians. Like when God looks down at the world, he sees us shining like stars when we make a decision to live this way. And it's all powerful stuff. Really strong. He says, even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I'm glad and I rejoice with you, and I want you to be glad and rejoice with me. Paul didn't think he had a lot longer, and we don't know for sure how much longer after Philippians he lived. Most people think he lived a couple years after that. But most of the rest of his life, from the time he wrote Philippians until the end, most of that time would be either in prison or at risk of being in prison. And Paul says, I won't be around forever. So I want you to shine in this way and make me proud. It's again, he really likes this church, and that kind of comes out in how he's talking here. And then, and I'm going to go through this pretty quick, he mentions two guys, and you could read through this and probably won't get a lot of memory verses out of it, but he mentions two guys who are doing it. You know, so not only is Jesus is always the great example, right? But if Jesus is my only example, you might say, well, then why do it? I mean, none of us are Jesus. But Paul says, well, it's not just Jesus. He says, Timothy, that's a great guy, and I hope he can come back to you pretty soon so you can be cheered up when he gets there. I got no one else like him. He shows genuine concern for your welfare, so he puts you first. Everyone else looks out for their own interests and not of Jesus. But you know Timothy, man, he's not like that. You know Timothy, man, he's thinking about you all the time. And he said he served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope I can send him to you soon so you can see how things are going with me. And then he mentions this other guy, and we don't know anything about him except for really this section. I'm also going to send back to you Epaphroditus. We think that this Epaphroditus was the guy who delivered that came to Paul from Philippi, and now Paul's going to send this letter back with Epaphroditus back to we think he probably carried it. So I'm going to send him Epaphroditus. He's my brother. He's a co-worker. He's a fellow soldier, and he's your messenger, and you sent him to help me take care of things, but he misses you. That's what it says here. He longs for all of you, and he was distressed because you heard he was ill, and he was ill. He almost died. But God had mercy on him, and not only him, but me too, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. And so I'm all the more eager to send him. So when you see him again, you'll be glad, and I can have less anxiety. And you want to welcome him when he gets there with great joy. Honor people like Epaphroditus. Now again, let's think through that. That's important. Epaphroditus is an example of a servant. That's why Paul's bringing him up here at the end. That's why he brings Timothy up. He says, I want you to honor people like that. I want you to lift them up. Now he says with this Epaphroditus, he actually risked his life. But you don't have to think about somebody like that. Just anybody who genuinely puts other people ahead of themselves. And you know some people like that. You do. These are the people Paul says you should honor people like that. You should really lift them up. This is what it's all about. This is what it's all about. So as we finish up here, and I'm going through Philippians 2, I guess that's my challenge to you today. A couple things. First of all, think about those people you know who are like that. Think about how you could tell them, hey, thank you. Think about how you could aspire to be more like that. And certainly as you reflect on Jesus and all that he's done for you, if you have any encouragement from his Spirit, any comfort from his love, any gift, that he's blessed you with in your whole life, man, then make my joy complete. Be like-minded about this, and let's think like Christ. And that's the lesson of Philippians chapter 2.